Welcome to Mortification of Spin, a casual conversation about things that count, with Carl Trueman and Todd Pruitt, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. Let's join this week's conversation.
Welcome to Mortification of Spin. My name's Carl Trueman. I'm Professor of Biblical and Religious Studies at Grove City, Western Pennsylvania. And I'm here with my long-standing friend and colleague, the Reverend Todd Pruitt, pastor of Covenant Presbyterian Church in Harrisonburg, Virginia. Todd, how long have we been doing this podcast?
Carl, we go back to the early days of podcasting. You might say that we're pioneers of a sort.
We are.
You know,
I actually think that kind of President Trump might owe his election to us, because no Truman and Pruitt, no Joe Rogan. It's as simple as that.
That's right.
Well, today's a very special day on the podcast, because it's not very often that Todd Pruitt can actually boast to be the hairiest man on the podcast in terms of what's on top of his head. But today we have a guest who is as follically challenged as I am myself. He's been on before. He is the professor of biblical studies at Greenville Presbyterian Theological Seminary. And he's, of course, our old friend Michael Morales, who's written a number of very interesting and very helpful books on the Old Testament, and has crowned his achievements recently by writing a massive 2-volume commentary on what is, I am sure, everybody's favorite book of the Old Testament, the book of Numbers. So great to have you on the podcast, Michael.
Thank you for having me. It's great to spend time with you and Todd.
Yeah, and it's great to have somebody like you writing on book of Numbers. I always feel like, in my own field of Reformation history, I was always glad for those guys who crunched all the sociological data in the 16th century, because it meant that I didn't have to bother. Very glad that we have people writing on the book of Numbers. Let's kick off. Most people, if like me, you do one of these Bible in a year programs, you hit Numbers, or you hit Leviticus, and it's a long death march to the sea at that particular point. Your heart kind of falls, little piece of you dies. Can you summarize in a minute and a half why Christians should take the book of Numbers perhaps more seriously, or see it as being more interesting than we typically do?
Yes, so the Torah, the Pentateuch, really is the foundation of all of our theology. It's the foundation of the canon, and it's more than just one long, continuous narrative that happens to be chopped up into 5 pieces. Each book really has its own angle in theology. And the book of Numbers is the one book dedicated completely to the covenant community, to analyzing it from every angle. It is rich with ecclesiology, and really all of that gets lost if the book of Numbers is ignored.
I pastor a church. Gratefully, I have a lot of people in my church who do Bible in a year reading programs. In fact, this past January, there were a bunch of people who talked to me who were saying, man, I'm going to, I've done it in the past. It's been a long time. I'm going to do it again. They've showed me the different kind of schedules they're using. And invariably, people say, now I don't know what I'm going to do with Leviticus and Numbers. And of course, you've written 2 really monumental works on Leviticus. We interviewed you several years back with Who May Ascend the Hill of the Lord, which is still now my go-to resource for Leviticus. And now you tackle Numbers. Now, I know you realize that that's kind of the reputation, is that Christians kind of skip over Leviticus and Numbers. What kind of counsel would you give? You just kind of alluded to some of it big picture wise, but I'm a layperson in a church, or heck, I'm a pastor, and I'm reading through my Bible in a year. What do I need to be looking for in Numbers? What do you want to alert me to as a Christian to be watching for? And how would you counsel me to read through Numbers in a way that's going to be really profitable, and for me get out of it what is there. I mean, because what you allude to about the Pentateuch is absolutely true. The Pentateuch is so crucial in our understanding of the gospel. What am I looking for in Numbers?
One of the big ideas and I think interpretive keys is to understand that the camp of Israel is the first historic covenant community. Now, of course, in a general sense, we can look back to Adam, Abraham, and say, they were the covenant community. But in terms of, I will be your God, you'll be my people, I'll dwell in your midst, this doesn't happen until the camp of Israel. And so as soon as we see that the camp is not just loading up the minivan to, make our way to the promised land, but it's actually the culmination of the Mosaic covenant. As soon as they got to Sinai in Exodus 19, we've been working toward this reality. So Exodus 25:8, the Lord says, let them build me a sanctuary that I may dwell in their midst. That doesn't happen until Numbers. And so in a sense, it just helps to know what is this census about. And when you can see what's going on, then Lord willing, you can have the perseverance through the details. But essentially, you have in the first 6 chapters this covenant community being built, and it's going to be the paradigm. Ezekiel uses it in Ezekiel 40 through 48 for the New Jerusalem. John uses it as well as Ezekiel. The Qumran Society of the Essenes, they understood that this is the ideal covenant community, God literally in the midst of his people. And once you get that, a reading strategy develops, because basically what happens in the exciting part, the wilderness sojourn, chapters 11 through 25, is the story starts traveling through the blueprint of the camp. So chapter 11, you may recall that the Lord's judgment is said to be on the outskirts of the camp. That's our first hint. So chapters 11 through 15 are all about what I call the outer camp of the 12 tribes. The word Levite is nowhere to be found in that section. Then we get to Leviticus 16 through 18. Suddenly we're in the Levitical camp, the inner ribbon. And lo and behold, you have Korah's rebellion against Aaron. And then in Numbers 20, we get to the very center, the kingship of the Lord misrepresented by Moses. And so once you kind of get the pointers, you can see that it's an analysis of the covenant community. And that's even the explanation for the Balaam narrative. Balaam, all of these oracles are giving us what some think is the highest theology of the covenant community, describing the camp as a paradisal garden when he looks down on it.
Yeah. It's interesting. I think one of the reasons why Numbers gets a bad rap is because it's called Numbers.
Exactly.
Because the fact is, there's a lot of drama in that book. I alluded to the Balaam narrative just a couple weeks ago in a sermon, and there are some key, very dramatic moments throughout the book of Numbers. If you were to rename the book of Numbers, if you were given the authority to rename the book of Numbers, what would you like to call it?
I mean, I could probably come up with something wittier if you gave me time. I'm very slow off the punch, but probably I would choose what's the more popular title in Hebrew, and that's In the Wilderness. I mean, that really gets to the heart. God's people in the wilderness with all of its challenges, both in the relationship with the Lord and with the outside communities and with internal sin, all of that drama, I think, in that way, like 1 Corinthians 10 and the book of Hebrews really relates the book of Numbers in such a profound way to our lives now in the wilderness.
Yeah, that's good.
Reading strategy is one thing, Michael. What about a preaching strategy? Is Numbers a book that you would recommend preachers approach, verse by verse, chapter by chapter? Or is it perhaps more akin to something like the book of Proverbs? I know a different genre, of course, but preaching on Proverbs or say Job, you're unlikely to go through it pericope by pericope, week after week. What strategy or strategies would you suggest are most helpful when approaching the book of Numbers from a pastor's, preacher's, homiletic perspective?
Great question. Once you get to the center part, 11 through 25, then I think you can approach it like one would the book of Genesis, because you really have episodes, and so you can preach episode by episode. I don't think you need more than one for each. So Korah's rebellion, I mentioned, could be one sermon. Before that, in those opening chapters, at least what I would do, having studied through the book deeply, is I would probably do one sermon on chapters 1 and 2, again, because that is pertaining to that outer camp of the 12 tribes. And so you have the idea of the church militant. Their goal is to conquer the land according to the word of God through Moses. And so what we find later on is they're going to be challenged according to their goal, and they're going to fail. Then chapters 3 and 4 is that Levitical inner camp. And there are a lot of hints of what's going to happen later on, foreshadowings of the later drama, even Korah's rebellion. And so one sermon on those two chapters, the need for priestly mediation in God's relationship with his people. And so I think that I would take sort of big chunks early on, and then once you get into the wilderness, and then also for the last third of the book, it really becomes episodic and I think a lot easier to navigate and intuitively, again, like the book of Genesis, where you can just take this story, whether it's one chapter or two chapters, and deal with it in one message.
That's very helpful. I think a lot of preachers tend to labor under the, misapprehension that you have to preach on every verse and you have to take every verse in order. And that can work, I think, very well, for example, in the Gospel of Mark,
Right.
Which is a gospel of continual, rapid change and action. Other books, not so susceptible to that, and you can end up, if you're not careful, having a very repetitive sermon cycles that can just leave people very cold at the end. So that's very helpful. It's good to be liberated in that way to approach the text.
Yeah. Carl, I think you and I some years ago, when you were serving on staff at a church, I think you and I might have been preaching through Job at about the same time. And I think we both took a similar approach. Opening section, took it very kind of piece by piece. Ending section, took it very piece by piece. But that vast middle portion of the Hebrew poetry, we tended to take kind of chapter by chapter or larger group for precisely that reason. Now, we also noticed that Christopher Ashe, in his commentary, he goes just bit by bit through the whole thing, but I'm not Christopher Ashe, so I didn't do that. But I saw kind of the wisdom in the same type of approach, say, to the book of Numbers. Michael, I wonder, what does the book of Numbers, and you've alluded to this a little bit, I want to see if we can kind of trace it out a little bit more. What does the book of Numbers teach us about Christ, about God's plan of redemption, and then also about, kind of the church? You've talked about how it presents to us, the building blocks of what the covenant community ought to be. But so how does it, in what ways does it point us to Jesus? And then in what ways does it teach us about what the church is supposed to be as well?
That's a great question. And I can give you a 50-minute answer, so just cut me off when need be.
No, you're good.
I mean, one way it points to Christ is by the offices of anointing. So again, for the outer camp, the main office that God's people need to be attentive to is the office of prophet. And so Moses is slandered and vindicated in chapter 12. In chapter 16 through 18, the focus is on the office of the priesthood, and especially the high priest. He gets slandered and his authority undermined, and God vindicates him with the budding staff. And then, of course, in Numbers 20, we get to the center of the camp, the kingship of the Lord. Moses fails in representing the Lord and suffers for it greatly. So in each of these cases, as we're looking at the covenant community and different aspects of its leadership, we're seeing great failures. And so I think for each section, there's a beeline there to the Lord Jesus Christ, but also how the goal of the covenant, the goal of atonement in Leviticus that's leading to the book of Numbers, is for this, what we would call union with Christ, the covenant community with the Lord at its center. And one of the bits of profound theology that the book conveys is you take away that central ribbon of the Levites, and the camp falls apart. God's fire must consume his people, the 12 tribes. And so the need for a priestly mediator for this covenant relationship to work is is one of the big aspects of its message. And then again, the beauty of the covenant community, that somehow a sinful people that the Lord has taken to himself can enjoy fellowship with him through this priestly mediation that he's set up, and all of the effusive, glorious, endearing remarks that are proclaimed by Balaam, the enemy of Israel, when he's filled with the Spirit, I think is something that we need to regain. He's looking at these people in the wilderness that are so tempted to envy the nations that have their homes, the vineyards that they've planted, the wells that they've dug out. And yet when Balaam looks at this community in the wilderness with God at its center, he sees the Garden of Eden. And that's a message we need today, where church membership, for example, is at a low, and the church is so persecuted around the world and marginalized and mocked. To teach through the book of Numbers is to give people an ecclesiology that reminds us, exactly what Balaam expresses. There's no other place I'd rather be than there, because they have God. And so those are a few ways. Chapter by chapter, there's many bridges to Christ, whether we're in Numbers 21 with the brazen serpent, or so there are glorious allusions and even direct messianic prophecies in the book of Numbers.
That's great, Michael. It leaves me, my standard concern about redemptive historical preaching is always every sermon ends up the same. Right. Okay, we have this text, but guess what? It leads to Jesus. Now let me tell you the same things about Jesus I told you last week and the week before that, And it's great. I mean, we all want to hear about Jesus all the time, obviously. But you're pointing there towards ways in which the different dimensions of Christ can be brought out. But can I ask you a question about, what are the practical applications that might come out of the book of Numbers as you preach it? Are there any practical applications, or is it really one that, ultimately it's just Christological in its application? Are there lessons we can learn for today from the desert wanderings of the people of Israel way back then?
Yeah, I think there are many. Numbers is the book of leadership. When Moses in Deuteronomy retells the story of the scouts' failure, he is just addressing the people, their culpability. Numbers focuses in on the 10 scouts and the responsibility and culpability of leadership. And so we're told in Numbers, for example, how they were immediately judged. They don't just die out slowly in the 40 years. And then later on in chapter 2, when the tribal leaders for Reuben and Gad say, hey, we like the land here, that's the first thing Moses says, is you realize what your leadership can do. You can cause another fiasco like in the last generation and discourage the people. So there are many implications for good leadership, bad leadership. And I think for the laity, a reminder to continually hold leaders in prayer. Also very practical, as I already mentioned, is the need for church membership and to rejoice in it and to see all of its benefits. The fact that in Numbers 6, another practical benefit, that we get the script for the priestly blessing there and not in Leviticus, because the camp has just been constructed and God at the center immediately wants to shine his face upon the people. And so you want to stay in this covenant community because that's the place of blessing. That relates to life in the church, but it also relates actually to the benediction of the typical worship service. It's not a closing prayer, and for people to get up to make it to their cars faster, or they've been using the restroom until that point. It's like you held on so long, and we don't cherish the blessing of God as we should, which is hugely significant. So in the drama of Numbers, God tells Balaam, you shall not curse them because they are blessed. That's not just a generic saying. They're blessed by the priestly blessing. And this stays back the powers of darkness, as it were. And so I could go on, but that's a few. I think the role of leadership and also church membership are hugely significant.
Yeah, that's really good. That's so helpful. You've mentioned Balaam a couple times, which is so instructive. I've been preaching through the book of Revelation, and just a few weeks ago, I mentioned Balaam. We've been working our way through chapters 2 and 3, the messages to the 7 churches. And Balaam came up in the sermon because, first of all, I was wanting to illustrate the Spirit's commitment to his church. And, when you go back to the Old Testament, to the book of Numbers, to Balaam, Balaam's there. He's been paid to curse the people of Israel. And even that pagan prophet, the Spirit of God comes upon him, and he couldn't help but speak out blessings upon God's people. God so overcame him that rather than cursing coming out of Balaam's mouth, blessings came out of Balaam's mouth. And there's comfort there because, what we learn about Balaam then from the New Testament is that he keeps failing to properly curse the people of God because of the Spirit's intervention. So he just goes directly to King Balak and he says, look, if you want to defeat the people of God, just use idolatry and immorality. It's not working through these, through my curses and my incantations. Just use those old steady tools, idolatry and immorality. And of course, nothing much has changed. I mean, those are still, it seems, the weapons of choice in the enemy's tool bag to use against the church today, isn't it?
That's right. Persecution or seduction, and seduction always proves much more effective.
Yeah, that's really good. And of course, part of the problem with receiving commentaries from you, which I'm so grateful to get them, but then I immediately want to start preaching through the book. That happened when I was reading through your book on Leviticus, and now I'm looking at this 2-volume set on Numbers, and I'm thinking, man, this will really preach. And it reminded me of just referring to Balaam a few weeks back in our series in Revelation here at the church I serve, and I was going back looking at this material in Numbers. And being so helped by it, because what we have in the book of Numbers, I was realizing more and more, is it's really dramatic. It's a redemptive drama, and it still has the power to comfort and to correct us and to remind us of what's true.
Sweet.
It was so rich, and I feel like now I'm ready to answer questions when people come to me and say, okay, Todd, I'm doing this read through the Bible in a year deal, and I'm coming up on Leviticus, or I'm coming up on Numbers, and I feel like I've got real ways now to encourage them about what they're going to read and about what it's going to mean to them. Yeah, one of my rules of thumb is that I have several authors I do this with, and you're one of them. If Michael Morales writes it, then I'm going to get it and I'm going to read it. You've been so helpful to me and to so many pastors I know in terms of helping us in broadening and deepening our knowledge and understanding of the Old Testament, particularly some of those books that Christians rarely go to. And if you're a preacher, you really do want to get your hands on this 2-volume set from Apollos. You may be already familiar with the Apollos Old Testament commentary series. They're excellent commentaries. And this 2-volume set on Numbers is no exception. So you want to get those, pastors. They're going to be helpful to you. Michael, what's next? Can you tell us what you're working on these days?
Sure. I've been working on a literary theological guide to the Pentateuch. I'm trying to keep it lay level by avoiding footnotes, but it's almost been like therapy for me. And so I do think it gets to deep theology, but Lord willing, it'll be readable. I should be working on a Deuteronomy commentary. And then there's a few other, like a theology of Numbers, I would love to do, because the commentary is a reference work and there's just such gems in there that I don't want to be lost on the average person that isn't going to read through a commentary. Possibly a commentary on Joshua and Genesis and a few other little things. But I was reminded to say today, like the book of James, if the Lord wills, we will live and do these things. But I'm thankful for the work. It's a joy.
Well, that's exciting. And I know you already have written kind of a shorter, less technical book on the theology of Exodus, right?
It is. It's kind of tricky. It's the Exodus movement. So basically just Exodus 1 through 15. In other words, the deliverance out of Egypt. And then I looked at that in the prophets and in the New Testament. And so not a theology of the book of Exodus proper, but the Exodus pattern, yes. And actually working on this guide to the Pentateuch, we know how the scriptures are so profound. I've just been hitting my head against the table going, how did I miss that? How did I miss this? And so I'm thankful for another occasion to just show something more of the riches of the book of Exodus, but also to extend it to the entire book this time.
Good. Well, if you're one of our listeners, I would encourage you to get a hold of this 2-volume set, this commentary on the book of Numbers. Professor Morales is always exceedingly well worth reading, and I would encourage you to make use of his material. When I'm having conversations with pastors about commentaries they're using, Michael's name comes up almost always in the conversation. I do want to say that Greenville Seminary might want to start giving some sort of a financial kickback to Carl and I, because I was talking to a student at a pastor's conference not long ago that Greenville Seminary was hosting. And Carl, you might be interested in this. I was really encouraged by this. He said, hey, look, I'm a student at Greenville. I wasn't sure where I was going to go. And then I heard you and Carl talking on Mortification of Spin, saying some really good things about Greenville Seminary. That sealed the deal, and he's a student now. So Jonathan Master, the president of Greenville, if you're listening to that, I think that's worth like some good Greenville Seminary swag, a nice sweatshirt or something like that. But anyway, think about that. Well, listen, I want to thank again our guest, Michael Morales. And as I'm looking here at the video feed of Carl, we're doing this by Zoom, and as I'm looking at him, he looks so much like Stanley Tucci. Carl, I feel like I need to ask you for some pasta or something.
You could ask me for some style tips, actually, Todd. That might be more helpful to you than pasta.
Well, Michael, thanks for joining us again. It was great to have you.
Thank you, brother. It's great being with you. God bless.
Same to you. Thanks. And listeners, again, thank you for joining us. Please go to our website, mortificationofspin.org. You can register to win some things there. We give away books and various other resources to folks who come in and sign up to win some of those things for free. And while you're there, if you'd like to make a financial donation to the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals, we're a listener-supported podcast, and if you'd like to do that, you can certainly do that as well. But we're so grateful that you joined us today. We look forward to being with you next time.
Emptied and tired, I draw closer to you. In the wilderness, I'm never all alone. In the wilderness, I'm not left on my own. There must be more to learn before the tide begins to turn.
Thanks for listening to Mortification of Spin, a podcast of the Alliance of Confessing Evangelicals. For more on topics like this, visit mortificationofspin.org, where you can find other articles by Carl and Todd, browse the archive of past episodes, and make a donation. We'll talk to you next time on Mortification of Spin.